All right, let me just give you a little bit more background on myself. I have built and run security for 5 public companies. A lot of them are cloud companies. So, I think I've been through this a couple times, all the way up to close to 100,000 hosts in Amazon's cloud. Have done it at scale. And my talk today is talking about kind of what seems to be the appeal of cloud environments, but also the complexity, which is very, very important for the security piece. I structured the talk to give you talking points and ideas to think about. I don't have the answers to all of them, but I think if you can leave here today with 3, 4, or 5 things that you take back into your environment that are from my experience, that are important, I think we together won. So I'll start out with, something really, really important, because when we talk about the cloud, often it's like, it's Amazon or it's Google or it's Azure or it's this or that. But actually, it doesn't really matter where it is. So most important thing as a security practitioner or somebody who is responsible for security in the cloud is to change how you think about cloud computing. It's how you do it, right? It's not where it is. Cloud computing can be in many places, can be in your own cloud, in your hybrid cloud, but it's really like a utility type, consumption type approach to compute power. So I'll talk today about kind of like what cloud question mark. I wanted to start it out with kind of questioning the whole notion we have around cloud and go into like there's no one cloud. We use the term like it is like there's one thing, but there's actually, it's a little bit more complex. Look at the user perspective. Cloud configuration, super, super important. We see a lot of issues happening there. Then data management, data goes into the cloud. Now what? Third-party risk management, business continuity, and data governance. So you can see already from this table, it's super easy, right? All you do is go to the cloud and all problems are solved. All right. Why is it going back? So when we talk about the cloud, like you read the news, the media, we go to the cloud and you start digging in a little bit. And we have been doing this, by the way, for 15 years, right? Cloud environments have been around for 15 years. So we've come a long way. Well, have we really? We've also created a lot of complexity. So initially, there were really only 3 types of delivery models, the infrastructure as a service and platform and then software as a service. But now, companies have become really, really creative. You have microservices and APIs and containers. And what you find is that these cloud environments have become so complex that it's really, really hard to hire talent for it. Security still struggles with the complexity. You buy one solution or utilize one solution for one specific cloud deployment. It works great. And the next one, it doesn't. So what you face is often a huge number of security add-on solutions that you need just to control what you are trying to utilize. The interdependency of services is also something you need to keep in mind. So, with every new way of doing compute, you go in, you enjoy it, you multiply it, but the beast becomes really, really complex quickly. And you end up in a situation, I give you an example of a tech company that is running 1,500 microservices to power their services for their customers. 1,500. There's no way that an individual in that company still understands how they all work together or what the interdependency of these things is. So from an architecture point of view, these things are becoming extremely complex and hard to control and protect. We see companies starting out, going into Amazon saying, this is really neat, AWS makes it so easy, or Google Cloud Compute, other environments. But then they also say, well, we could do some of that ourselves, right? So we just burst into the cloud, utilizing hybrid clouds or even multi-clouds. More and more companies we now see, I see often in conversations that started out with one cloud vendor and now are saying, no, we actually want to use a couple more because we don't want to put our eggs in one basket. Sometimes there's price advantages. And suddenly you're with an environment where you use compute power from 3, 4 companies and you own, and you have to manage that. And interestingly enough, what you deploy in terms of controls or security solutions does not work across all these environments the same way. So this is an interesting survey that was done by Puhlmann. You can see that 60% surveyed said actually that their cloud deployments have accelerated past their ability to secure them. 60%. That's 2/3 acknowledge that they have lost control. So the question for you is, how many of these 60% are you utilizing every day in your business and rely on? That's 2/3 of all surveyed. I guarantee you, most of you utilize at least one company that was part of these 60%. And if they have lost control or they admit they lost control, then you cannot claim you have it either. User perspective. So this is a very US-centric view, I admit that, but I think it's a good example for you to kind of see what happens when compute environments are really user-friendly and made easy. You might remember the old days when we were talking about shadow IT and, we were trying to cut it down and people would stand up their own data centers or buy computers and they shouldn't. Actually, guess what? Shadow IT is back. Bigger than ever. Why? Because it takes a credit card to swipe and you have your compute environment. And you can bypass financial controls, which often have been designed, for the older days. And suddenly you find out that a company has assets all over the place, but nobody really knows where they are. Why is that important? Well, from a legal perspective it is, but also from a data governance perspective, right? Because if there's a cloud or, some sort of compute environment, I'm sure there's data on it. And if you don't know it exists, you cannot protect it. So give you an idea of how bad it is. The average tech company in Silicon Valley right now connects to 300 to 500 cloud providers a month. That's the number of cloud providers that are connected to, meaning are necessary to power the normal course of business. That's when you really start monitoring and looking like where are the connections going, what cloud providers are behind it. 300 to 500. Now imagine you would have to do a data catalog and really find out, well, what do we do with these cloud providers and what data do we give them? And even better, do we even have a contract in place? Because if we don't and we give them data, then guess what? We really have no control at all. Cloud configuration. So you have seen probably a lot of the media reports, articles about S3 buckets being, unprotected, left out there. And really the issue is with configuration in the cloud, it's really, really difficult. I don't know how many of you have really dug into just AWS's environment and really gone deep, how hard it actually is to understand what you're doing. And, when you start out as a new user, it's really user-friendly. It's made easy. You're up and running really super fast. But guess what? To actually lock it down is extremely hard. The incident at Capital One, I think, drove us home for everyone. So Capital One had an incident. There's some complexity to it because the person that kind of created the incident was a former employee of Amazon and abused a vulnerability in how configurations were actually handled at Amazon. I don't even want to call it really like an exploit because it was known that there was an issue. And I can tell you from experience, there's many of these. Capital One has and had an amazing security team and program. They really know what they're doing. But if they get hit with something like this, you can imagine what would happen to many other companies. So my point here is, if you already deal with a lot of complexity and on top now have to have experts that know every cloud computing environment and their configurations in detail, it's pretty hard. Finding these, I would say probably right now, finding cloud talent at that level is probably harder than application security engineers. But just extremely rare. And, these things change. Amazon brings out a new service. There's a whole new slew of configurations. And how do they affect other configurations of another Amazon service? Oh, and now, by the way, you also use Google Compute and a little Azure, and you throw in a little bit hybrid cloud. Good luck. It's extremely hard. So I would say, configuration management, even though we are add-on solutions, is one of the big pitfalls right now, and really something I would encourage you to not take lightly. Here's a statistic from SANS Institute. You can see 31% of organizations reported unauthorized access. Obviously, credential hijacking, number one reason, but number two, poor configuration. So these all could have been prevented if things would have been configured appropriately. And appropriately is sometimes hard to know what that is in these environments. A lot of cloud providers still, out of the box offer weak defaults. So if you sign up and, you want to get something up and running, please remember the purpose of getting easy up and running was not to secure your data. The purpose was to get up and running easily and quickly. So there's a lot of afterwork that has to happen. So your data is in the cloud. Problem solved. You can relax. You can go home now. You don't have to watch it, right? It's there. It's perfect. But where did it actually go? There was a report, I think, just 2 days out that Apple was called out because it was sending certain data to check for malicious activity actually to Tencent in China, unbeknownst to a lot of the users. And we see this all the time where you have a contract with a certain cloud provider and, it's very clearly stipulated where the data should go, even which country it should go, because that does have legal consequences. And then you find out, months later that this certain provider did a deal with another company, and unbeknownst to you, they have used another solution, let's say for logging or for analysis of certain things. And now data is in a country that creates a huge nightmare for you. Because often, it's not our data as a company, it's the data of our customers as well. And we are kind of responsible for that. So, managing and trying to maintain control of, where the data actually goes once you put it in the cloud is extremely hard. And then, what about the contracts? So you should actually talk with your lawyers and with your procurement folks, what provisions you have in there. Like, are you specific, what your vendors or your third parties can do, with the data, where it can go, how long they can keep it, what else they can do with the data. With some, like the Cloud Act, with some legislation or GDPR lately, this has become very important. It's not just you put data in a certain cloud environment and that's it. Do you have a right to audit? So I understand, like I told you earlier, 300 to 500 cloud providers, managing them all and potentially asking for a right to audit in your contracts is a lot, but that's actually what it takes. If you think about vendor management, and I'll talk to that a little bit later, the moment you hand your data to somewhere else, you kind of need to go through due diligence, right? You should be asking questions like about the vendor, what their security program looks like, what their controls look like. Because if you don't, and something happens to it, then you're liable, right? You haven't done a minimum check that you should be doing. Now, I understand with 300 to 500 vendors, that's a lot, but that's really what it takes. And if we would look at this realistically, we probably wouldn't end up with 300 to 500 vendors because actually it doesn't scale. And perhaps that's actually, the more mature way to look at it. I know 2 larger companies right now in Silicon Valley have actually started to squeeze on the number of cloud vendors. Because engineers always say, hey, we found this new solution. This is really cool. We need to have it, right? In order to be competitive. And now kind of a pressure goes into the other direction, says, no, we already have too many we can't handle. So if you want this new solution, you need to give up on another one. Because it takes overhead to manage all these vendors. And I think we'll see actually change happening in the landscape, where so far it was always more, more vendors, more solutions. It's all good as long as I achieve my goals. But it has reached a level where, especially with a lot of manual work that's necessary, you can't do that anymore. So, there's a shift, less vendors, and also more mature vendors. But I'll get to that in a little bit. Third-party risk management. So, If you haven't used it, haven't heard about it, there's a cybersecurity framework that NIST brought out, NIST CSF, and it's increasingly used between companies to measure not the residual risk, but the maturity of the security program or the posture. And we started using that with some of our vendors, and I can tell you it's positive in many ways. Number one, it changes the conversation. Instead of saying, we need to look at your controls and we want to basically find the risk that you haven't been thinking about, the conversation is now, we want to see how mature you operate. So do you think a startup of 10 people can have a mature security program? Probably not, right? But that's exactly the conversation you need to have. Give you one kind of example, company that is actually used a lot. We did dig a little bit deeper. We found out that there's no dedicated security personnel. The CTO is not just the CTO, but also the chief security officer and many other things at the same time. And literally, the program was never created. It was just a bunch of policies written. So on a maturity scale, you would give them a 0. Completely immature. You shouldn't do business with them. But the risk matrix, they had actually done a good job in describing why there is hardly any risk. I would still make the argument that the risk is higher if you operate sloppy. That's actually how I describe it. So there is a shift in the thinking of more towards maturity and really, pressuring each other. A lot of pressure comes from the healthcare industry. Just saying, how do you do the things you actually say you do? Not what do you do, but how do you do them? Do you have it written down? Do you have repeatable processes? Do you check your processes? Do you improve them? Are you a well-oiled machine? Because if you are, the likelihood that something will go wrong is smaller. And, this is one area where I think we can probably do better if we focus more on maturity around third-party risk management. Because at the end of the day, we rely on all these vendors extremely, and we can together in a community, I think, drive maturity up and do a better job there. Just a question kind of from folks who are here. How many of you actually have a dedicated third-party risk management program? One, I saw one. 2, 3 perhaps. It's interesting, right? So your reliance on third parties is already so high, but hardly anyone looks at them. And, I mentioned earlier when I started, hopefully I give you 2, 3, 4, 5 things to think about. If you go away here today and say, yeah, it was kind of interesting what Nils talked about, this is the one thing you want to think about. There's nothing more important than managing the risk of the companies that you rely in your business every day with. Anything goes wrong at any of these companies, it becomes your problem. There was a small company in Silicon Valley called 24AI that had a major incident. Nobody really talked about their incident, but then actually they did, because you know why? Delta Airlines nearly had to shut down for a whole day, and 2 banks as well, because they all used them for AI processing. So that company was, I think, small, 10, 20 people. Their incident became a much larger incident because of the implications it had. And I was chatting last week with a couple CISOs in the Valley, and we were actually thinking about it would be interesting to do a dependency map where you put all the vendors on and who depends on them. I guarantee you we would probably find 3, 4, 5 companies that everyone highly depends on, but nobody has really looked at. And that creates a cascading effect. Then the DNS had a major outage and 30% of the internet went down, even though it was a small company, right? So please go back into your business and start thinking about third-party risk management. You'll make your life better, but also you improve overall the maturity of the ecosystem and the industry, which is really, really important. Business continuity management. So one of the appeals of the cloud was, well, it's always on. It can never fail. Or can it? We have seen larger providers like Google and even Amazon had outages. So what do? You rely more and more on more other parties, but how do you plan when something goes wrong? Oh, and by the way, 80% of Whoever vendors, cloud vendors you rely on, guess where they run their compute? Also on Amazon. So if that would really go down one day, then when we all go home for a day or two and stop working, that's obviously not acceptable, especially if you work in industries where, like healthcare, others, where you cannot fail. You just can't. There will be lives at stake. You know, IoT, self-driving cars. I mean, there will be more and more industries that failure is not an option. So how do you plan for it? So one suggestion is you should write down all vendors and cloud services that you need to operate critical business processes. Don't do it the other way around. Just list them all down and then say, here's my critical business processes. Who do I rely on? Most likely you'll come up with between 5 to 10 that are absolutely mission critical. And no, they are not the vendors you need to generate revenue. These are the vendors you need to keep the lights on. There's a difference. Write them down, and then you should have a much higher bar for these. Because now you know, here's my 5 vendors. If anything happens with these, I will eat it. My company will be affected. And that has an impact on everything downstream. You might be a vendor who offers services to others. So if something happens with you, it has a cascading effect on others. But do the exercise. It's actually not too hard. Walk around the business, say, you know, here's our critical business processes. It's probably not procurement, but it might be things like, you know, paying people or, you know, depending on what services you offer, being on or shipping. Write them down and then just look into, you know, what your dependencies are around vendors. And then, like in the Cloudflare incident or the DNS that I mentioned earlier, have a conversation with your cloud vendors to do the same, because you also want to know that they have done the exercise who they rely on. And eventually you can map it. You can kind of have a tree where you have all these cloud vendors and you say, you know, here's the ones I need, and then here's my top vendors that I rely on, and here's the ones they need. You quickly, there's obviously companies like Amazon that a lot of companies rely on, but there will be others that you quickly identify and then make it a community problem. You know, there are smaller companies who just become successful really, really fast. And suddenly everyone takes a dependency on them. And what we have done is a program where we help smaller companies to do it right, because we like their services, we like what they're doing, their heart is in the right place, they just don't have the experience. So we actually sit down with them and say, okay, here's the things you should be doing first. Here's what you need to look at. And then you come back to us and show us progress. So we help them, so they help us. Because every little thing we invest in this smaller company, right, pays off big for us, because the likelihood that they make a major mistake is smaller. We have started reaching out to other companies that do the same, and now we do it together. So if you come across a company where, you know, that we kind of haven't had this umbrella over, healthcare industry is doing that. They actively work with smaller suppliers and vendors, especially cloud providers, to kind of lift them up from a security maturity point of view, help them, teach them, train them. So the whole ecosystem kind of benefits. And obviously the larger healthcare providers have the means and the funds to do this. I think we'll see more coming. Data governance. So that's a fancy term that we haven't seen too much in security programs yet, but I have a feeling we'll see more. It's basically the whole life cycle of data, right? As a company, you either get it, you produce it, you store it, you process it, and at some point, actually, you should delete it. Well, that last part we haven't really figured out before GDPR, but we should, and we will. There will be more regulation that kind of, you know, shifts the power back to the data subjects. And I think it's pretty clear where that's going. Data is the gold of the internet age, but we haven't really, as companies, thought about data as an asset that we need to have a program and a life cycle around. Security cannot function well unless you know where your data is, you know who has access to it, how it's used, where it's going, and then eventually how and when it will be deleted. it's interesting to do the exercise even with some of your suppliers and say, okay, imagine I would come to you and give you 50 data records and I want you to delete them. Could you? Try that. Try that with a couple cloud companies. 50 data records. Can you delete them now? I guarantee you the answer is, well, we'll come back to you about that because our architecture was not created for deletion of data. It was created to hold and store and process massive amounts of data. And then the question is, what does deletion even mean? I have received answers from companies, yeah, we deleted the data. And so, well, what did you do with it? Well, we marked the part in the database table that this data is now deleted. Okay, so the data is still there, but it's marked. Yes. Okay, well, that is not sufficient. Well, there's no other way we can do it. Oh, and by the way, you have to go back on your backup tapes and delete the data too, right? Because deleting means it's gone. We just have never really prepared for that. But this is where things are going. And so I encourage you, we started it about a year ago. It was kind of rocky initially because there is not too much you can actually read out there about it. But we said, let's just greenfield, let's start, put a team together. We had a privacy lawyer and I had somebody from my security organization. We had an architect and we said, let's define this as a program. And I would say it took about 6 months until things really started moving. And now we have like an example architecture that we kind of agreed upon. And everyone, every stakeholder put their own kind of needs in. But privacy lawyer said, well, it would be really good if we would have these type of things in there. And what came out was that we need to build a complete new separate architecture for our next data lake that has all these things in. It was never something that you consider when you build a company initially. So that's, probably another area where I would encourage you start reading about it. Think about it, like how would you define the data lifecycle? Could you even find all the data in your company? Do you know where all the data is? I know it sounds like a silly question, but most companies would probably tell you, we think we know. I went about a year ago to a company you all well know, you probably use every day, to the CIO, and I said, so can you show me all your compute assets? We actually talked about data. I said, do you know how many machines or instances you have right now? He said, no. I said, well, then how do you know where your data is? And we ended up in this whole conversation. Well, we use cloud. There's always machines go up and down and we cycle and we patch. It's okay, but all of this holds data, right? So how could you know at any given moment where all your data is and what that data is? And you can't. So this is probably a huge growth area where we look at security at a much more data-centric, in a much more data-centric way versus in the past we have, and this is how security started, right? It started probably network security and then machine security later. It was always very much asset or communication-based, focused. And now we really need to make that shift. And at the end of the day, if you lose something, it's data. If something gets breached, it's data. That's what really the world worries about. And we need to put more focus on that. And data governance programs are great ways to do that. So this is kind of scary statistic. Only 70% of businesses have good visibility of all critical data. 7%. That's less than 10%. Just to flip that around, that means 93% of businesses do not have good visibility of their critical data. What are we doing? That's like close to flying blind. Now, 58%, that's a saver, have slight control. Slight control is like driving a car and saying, I'm still on the road. I haven't driven off. That's slight control. So lots of room to grow, right? You would agree. All right. We have, actually lots of time for questions. I hope you have a lot of questions.
Are there any questions from the room? Yeah.
Good morning. My question is around, like, in terms of getting assurance on a cloud vendor that they have security in place, instead of the entity individually going and testing for itself, how much we can rely on SOC reports and other reports that are done independently to provide that assurance?
So there's kind of like a sliding scale, right? Like, obviously, if a company went through ISO certification, that's an effort. I would say that is not a description of how much risk they really have in their environment. That just shows that they have looked at security holistically. SOC 2 Type 2 takes more effort. And then, eventually HIPAA, FedRAMP, it gets harder and harder. That's actually why we said we don't want to follow this anymore and be focused on the NIST CSF standard. Because we wanted to look how mature does a company operate from a security point of view. Because, look, I have seen SOC 2 Type 2 reports from companies where I'm actually friends with the CISO, so I know what's really happening. You can do it. You can do it. It's really not, it's harder, but not hard. It's up to you, obviously, from a legal perspective and a liability perspective, having a SOC 2 Type 2 is great. You have something to show, and we always wanted in security something to show. But at the end of the day, I rather have a number based on the NIST CSF framework that shows me where they are, right? If nothing is written down and they do IR based on whoever is available and somehow, I don't really feel comfortable, If there are no processes they really follow, no run books, they do it kind of like based on experience. I don't really care if you have a SOC 2 Type 2. You just don't run very mature. So I understand that takes more work, but I think if we all start asking for it, then companies will have these external, CSF assessments, then you can have honest conversations, and you can say, look, we are not very mature today, but we will be. In a year, we want to be at 3.0 is 3.5, and here's the things we will do. Here's the projects we will launch. Because the SOC 2 Type 2, you renew it and basically you look at the same stuff all over again. It's not really a holistic view. In fact, if you know more of how you can choose which domains you focus on, there's a lot of tricks you can play there, right? Yeah, we all know them. Hope that answers your question.
All right. Are there any other questions from the room?
Someone right here.
Give me a second to give the mic to you.
Yeah, good morning. Now, in the same subject now for SOC 2 Type 2, what's the advantage that NIST CSF can provide? As most of us, we know, end of the day, SOC 2 Type 2, it's not certification. It is just opinion-wise and reporting. Now, with extra issue, how much it will be compliant to our current specific situation here in UAE? End of the day, starting from SAS 70 to SOC 1 to SOC 2, it is United States-based. So, the number one question, what's the added value with the NIST framework? Number two, what degree of reporting? Is it just opinion? Is it certification? And the measurement criteria? Plus, how much is adapted, aligned to our local situation in United Arab Emirates?
So the NIST CSF was a lot of the language was actually utilized in the latest language that the Europeans adopted. So perhaps there's a sign that we are learning from each other. It's not just like a US approach or standard. So, hopefully there will be more of that going forward. It's not a certification that you can get, right? So I think what I hear, we have a question, SOC 2 Type 2, you have a paper, you can show it everyone, you're good, right? It's not that easy with NIST CSF. But what we have done, we actually do our own assessments, external once a year. Every quarter we do our own assessment. There's now a couple of vendors that you can actually put all your data in, and it shows you real time where you are on the maturity curve by area that the NIST CSF framework calls out, and you can even go down into control groups if you want to. It's pretty neat. And we have these conversations with other security teams. We're very open about it, very transparent. Here's where we are right now, and here's the things we'll do to get to the next level. The nice thing about it is you change the conversation, right? Because if you show somebody a SOC 2 Type 2, you basically say, I'm good, leave me alone. That's what it is, right? That's why we always want these certifications. Here we have a conversation, hey, we know we have room of improvement. We share with you where we are and how we do things and what we found out and how we want to change it. And you basically start talking to the security team of another company that wants to utilize you, for example, and suddenly you speak the same language. They see you want to improve, they feel you're really transparent where you probably have work to do. And then they start doing the same actually with themselves. It requires a new thinking where we have to be a little bit more open and transparent. We actually, if I may add to this, we went a step forward. We have now an advisory committee of several CISOs from customer companies that come in once a quarter, and we show them where we are, our progress, and also how we prioritize, and they give feedback. Because what we wanted to do, we said, look, we think we know what we are doing, but we make mistakes. Why don't we let others, that are really, really good in that area come in and take a look and give us feedback? And it really changes. Like we had one situation where we weren't completely sure, and we asked them, what would you prioritize? And they gave us feedback. I mean, we kind of chose based on their input. I think the NIST CSF model requires you to have conversations with your customers and vendors more than you did just with an ISO, certification seal or a SOC 2 Type 2 or before with SAS 70s and other things. It was, remember, these things were invented to satisfy auditors, right? It's like, here, here's the paper. Okay, next. But that's not really how security works anymore, especially in a highly complex world. That is long gone. I hope that answered your questions a little bit. More questions?
Are there any other questions from the room?
Gentleman here.
Hi, yeah, I just wanted to discuss a little bit more your thoughts on when you were talking about business continuity and you just cannot fail when you're looking at critical processes within an organization. Obviously, the platform is the cloud, but would you be saying that to plan for continuity, you should look at something that's not the cloud as a real cannot fail scenario?
I think as a first step, you need to define what your expectation is as a company, right? Like depending on your business model, how much failure can you take? Is it an hour? Is it a day? Whatever it is. And then anything needs to be on the table. Now you will find quickly that often the expectations and the cost to actually get there, they're mostly not achievable, right? Everyone wants to be always on, and then you look into how many millions of dollars extra it would cost. So, okay, let's forget this idea. What's the next best thing, right? You come to a compromise. It's a little bit like risk management, right? You can't mitigate every risk. It's impossible. At least financially impossible. But potentially, yes, you have a traditional backup environment, or you have another cloud provider that, runs independently. Like there are ways you can mitigate these, or you just say, you know what, this is just a risk we just have to accept, right? But what you will be able to do is, find out kind of self-inflicted wounds where you say, well, we rely on whatever, 10 critical vendors. Oh, and by the way, they all 100% use Amazon and all in the same availability zone. And by the way, all in Virginia 1 or 2, right? Like, okay, that's probably not a good idea, right? So these type of things. Then you might say, all right, you might talk to one of these vendors. Have you thought about this? Because we did this exercise, and have your other customers talked to you about it? You might be surprised. They might say, yeah, we actually in the process of, running a little bit more fault tolerant. Just going through the exercise alone will give you a lot of other pathways. Not using the cloud might be one. It's an expensive one. You don't want to have hardware like sitting around collecting dust for something that might never happen once every 5 or 10 years, right? But it's a possible scenario, absolutely.
All right. Are there any more questions from the room? No? All right. Then I guess it's time to break for lunch. Nils, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we'll continue here after lunch at 2 o'clock with the lab sessions.